Hello and welcome back to another episode of the War Report, courtesy of our friends here. What's the Russian intelligence now? FSB, GRU. Which one are your handlers out of? Because I want to know who to properly thank for your internet uplink in light of the Canadian outage.
The FSG.
Okay. One would have thought Macedonian intelligence, but then it's they launder these things. It's a real convoluted process that we're not going to get into. But we are back, one day delayed than what I would have originally expected because Canada did have an internet outage that left millions without connections for about 23 hours. So just to start the show, why don't you just give us a briefing on the third world state of Canada over the past 48 hours?
Well, I mean, we went without service for nearly 24 hours, about 21 and change, at least where I was. I didn't get service again until like just before 2 a.m. And even then, my home service, there was something that wasn't quite right. That kicked in later. So I ended up using all my data. Uh, yes. I even there's even a Czech guy that comes into my work, and we talk once in a while, Ponaše, and he like unironically, but with like a bit of a twinkle in his eye, said, it could be the Russians, and I'm thinking like, wow, like you would think like uh uh the Canadians are just that important to Russia. We must hack the Canadians.
Well,
It's
where else are you going to
it's kind
find
of
any more
preposterous.
Ukrainians than outside of Ukraine itself? Think about it.
Yeah, I mean, right now Canada's sort of doing everything that Russia kind of wants it to do, like, with respect to say that turbine that Siemens is supposed to take care of for the Nord Stream 1. That took a while, and what that's doing is right now it's crushing the German economy. Particularly one German company that is like on the brink of foreclosure. I think it was something called Perrin or Airpen, or forget the name of it now. Anyways, um, Russian gas has been cut like nearly in half, and depending on which company you're talking about, it could be a little bit more than half. They claim they've lost 60%. And Germany, like the Netherlands and Austria, and I believe France, have started burning coal. Uh, which kind of brings me back to, the idea of how in liberal democracies, I sat with a friend, a lib friend, that gets more and more angered if I say that the West is in decline. It's almost like insulting his mom. And he will reassure me that it's not. It has, in fact, never been more united. I jokingly said, that sounds like a talking point by that guy Zakaria on CNN. Uh, I said, in a liberal democracy, basically, you create, because it's the art of leading without looking like you're leading. And I said, uh, in a liberal democracy, the point is to create pressure groups that help steer the culture in a certain direction so you can then institute the laws. But it's you who are holding. And I said, I brought up Greta Thunberg, who he admired. And I said, notice Greta is not anywhere to be seen. I mean, you've got four major countries. The biggest industrial country in Europe, Germany, is burning coal. People are literally chopping wood to have enough energy for the winter. And she's quiet. Because I said, like BLM, it's not an opportune time. So I go, that's how you know that it's not a grassroots movement. It's just a movement that's funded by various NGOs who work very closely with the government in the first place. And it's kind of funny how this war has brought up, like, it's made transparent the mechanisms at work in a liberal democracy. But at the same time, it's revealing just how invested people are in it, right? Like I think people understand that the West is in a very crucial moment right now, and maybe what happens by the end of 2022 will determine many, many things for decades, and I think they know that. And there's certain things that they don't like about about where the West is going, and they will plug their nose, you know, and endure that because, well, like Poland and the Baltic states, you know, gay marriage is still worth it if it means I'm not under Putin's communism. Like there's still people who accuse Russia of being communist. It's hilarious. Russians have a higher percentage of owning their own homes than Americans do, but you have to listen to like nonsense about that it's communist,
Yeah,
and all
it's a
yeah.
real worker state over there in Russia. It's
Mm.
just real internationalist too. As I've been assured, especially compared to the American Empire, which is a very nationalistic entity that respects the sovereignty of individual nations and ethnicity and culture. I'm assured of all these things as opposed to the internationalist Bolsheviks operating out of Moscow to this day.
Yeah. Yeah, I said to him, my little line that I've been saying recently. I said, America fought a war for independence, and all these countries are fighting to become dependent on America. um,
Yeah, I will just field the question, not to turn this into too much an interview, but just among that crowd of people, because again, not to give too much personal information away about your friend. I know you said like he's Central Eastern European diaspora from that sort of generation. How many of them still view America as, say, like what it was from just say like the 50s to the 80s as a modestly conservative, nominally Christian capitalist nation, as opposed to whatever the hell it is today? Like, what do you think the general perception of it is among that sort of demographic?
that's a very good question because I think in many ways he eschews that definition, and I'll tell you why. Because like me, he was very young when his family came here. He's quite a bit older than I am. Uh, his father took part in the uprising in 1956. Him and his mother actually had to hide in a forest until it was safe, and then they got out. So these memories for him are very vivid, right? And nothing is going to shake that for him, right? He literally, like, without me even asking, why do you support the West, or why do I? He came up with an answer as if I asked that. So, for instance, he said, I support the West because I don't want to live under a totalitarian government, implying like if the West loses this, then he's going to live under a totalitarian government. And I'm going, well, whose totalitarian government are you going to live under, right? On the other hand, I think the kind of person that you're describing, I've met them, and I have a good friend of mine who, although he was born here, his parents are from Romania. He's of mixed Romanian and Greek heritage, but mostly Romanian. And he went to the truckers protest, and he hung out with a fellow Romanian of Hungarian descent, and he spoke to a Polish woman, and he spoke to some other people, and you know all they were saying was this: Canada's turning into a country like the country I was born in the Eastern Bloc. Now, my friend that I'm talking about will never ever say that. So, like, for instance, at one point in my conversation with him, I said, this is all relative, right? Like, your values are very closely aligned with the most powerful people and their ideology that they promulgate in this society. So it's impossible for you to actually feel oppressed. But if you don't have the same opinion, you won't feel that way. I said, for instance, when I've gone to Russia, I've never felt oppressed there, and I've stayed there for extended periods. I said, that's because my values are not that different, right? Um, and because I mean, that bothers him because um, they fundamentally believe, like they're still in that Fukushima moment. And I would argue, even the people who are arguing against where the direction that Canada is going, and some of their opinions overlap with ours, and will say that the West and Canada are going in a totalitarian direction. I would say even they, in a sense, live in that Fukushima 90. This is they believe that whatever the West resolved at that time in the 90s is not only optimal, that is the fulfillment of the universal truths from the Age of Enlightenment. Whether they can articulate it that way or not, whatever they articulate, in fact, will match with my characterization, anyways, whether they use those same words or not,
Yeah,
right?
they're very much imbued with how I would put it, a classical form of the civic religion, as it were, as opposed to the even more modern forms, even the modern conservative form about, say, like a 1950s or 1980s Western world. But like again, like down to the like you're saying, like the most like basic principles of like Enlightenment liberalism, in insofar as that's civic
Yeah.
religion in and of itself. That on some level they still feel a level of dedication to it, whereas I think you and I, and probably most people who would be listening to something like this or anything in these circles, would have at least a partial, if not a full, rejection of that view.
Right. And I think there's another difference here, right? So it also depends like what class you are, right? Because his co-ethnics that disagree with him are not, I mean, I wouldn't describe him, he's not like uber wealthy, but he is most certainly upper middle class, like well upper middle class, like 2 vacations a year to exotic places, to interesting places. Nice house, not in the least bit ornate. This would have been very much a kind of house of a typical family where I am in southern Ontario. 2-story. It's an older house, but the location is prime. But it's not. So you know what I mean. He is definitely upper middle class. So for him, like even when I said to him, like, because he insisted on the rule of law, the rule of law, the rule of law, right? He like unironically he doesn't even ask himself, well, whose rules and whose laws? Again, because the West fundamentally has fulfilled the universal truth about how society should be organized. That is self-evident after the fall of the Soviet Union. That is what they fundamentally believe, right? So, for instance, I said to him, Trudeau took away, even though 95% of the truckers who were protesting were all vaccinated, the media intentionally mischaracterized what their demands were. It lied about them. It took away their trucks. It sold their trucks. It froze their bank accounts. It threw some of them in jail, and they have nothing. And you know what that demonstrates? I said to him, and he goes, "What?" I go, "It demonstrates the Schmittian principle." He's still looking at me, and I said, "Sovereign is he who is above the law." And I said, "Peacetime proves nothing. Only in a stressful or war period does the sovereign really emerge, and that is when Trudeau emerged. That Trudeau proved he was the sovereign, but he had to do it by bending the law, and
Yes, and I
he
do
had to do
think,
it.
just as a converse example, since you brought up that the whole Charker debacle and Trudeau making that power move, on the contrary, during the fun summer of 2020 in the United States, Trump proved himself to be the exact opposite. And you can even go through,
Yeah,
if you believe some like the internal leaks that Trump wanted to do X, Y, or Z. Point being is, even if he wanted to do that, he was still so constrained to the point where, by definition, he was not sovereign because he could not order a
yeah.
crackdown on these movements or whatever. And again, ultimately culminating him losing even the official title of power.
Right, right. Now, I remember bringing up the protests, the BLM protests, and it was more of a kind of like, oh dear, dear, that wasn't nice. But ultimately, he's not afraid of them. Ultimately, what he is afraid of are the truckers. That ultimately is what scares him. Men with charisma in powerful positions scare him, right? Because all of those things could lead to the opposite end of the pole of good and evil post World War II in the Boomer Truth regime, right? So that sounds like Hitler. That sounds like Stalin. That's what these truckers sound like to me. Uh, they're Nazis basically. Like, now he didn't say any of those things. He's smarter than that. But ultimately, it's those kind of people that scare them more.
Yeah, because they recognize
And
that even if they don't hold these beliefs exactly, it is at the very least an implicit rejection of their values.
right, but I think he also knows, what does the regime want? What does the regime think? What are the options to the regime, right? And there simply isn't a better option. And I said, you have no fundamental disagreements. You might disagree whether this law could have been interpreted more harshly, or it should be 25% of such and such type of immigrant rather than 35. But there's no major disagreement. It's just a question of numbers and execution and timing, but not the fundamental goals. And like I say, like I think there's a fear that has set in, right? My favorite moment, I will say, is he says, I go, why do you think that the West has never been stronger? And he says, because it has self-correcting measures, right? Like, of course, he says this unironically, right? Like many boomers, uh, they have like amnesia for what America has done. Like, take away everything America's done. Just focus on America and Iraq. What it did was so wrong. It has, and for me, Iraq alone destroyed America's uh, validity as a country. Period. They are as bad as every country it has ever criticized, and for them, it's a kind of amnesia, right? Like, they will tolerate that. Like, I didn't say to him, like, well, what self-correcting measure did America enact after invading Iraq? Well, I mean, they didn't. They destroyed Libya, and they've been trying to destroy Syria. Like, what are you talking about? Uh, anyways, like, like, I didn't get into that, but he's describing these self-correcting measures, and I said, okay, that's great, but what about the West? And he says, no, I was describing the West. I go, I know, I couldn't resist.
Oh
so
boy.
so it was really something. I only bring him up because I think it really does shed a light on, if you're looking at polls, for instance, who is like for the war, who is for more military funding to Ukraine. Like, it's this kind of guy, right? This is the kind of guy that is for that. Um, you'll never talk them out of it. Like, there is no sin that America can make that America cannot be redeemed from, even though America is not his country. In that sense, he fully understands that America's the boss, but then he'll at the same time will tell you that all these countries work independently. They just really get along. That's why they never have disagreements. It's so preposterous, right? But I think 10 years ago he would not have sounded this way. Like, it's paradoxical. He believes it's stronger, but his message is more simplified. It has less nuance. And I think maybe the only point at which maybe I created in him a certain kind of uh, dissonance is when I said, about 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, we had TV could demonstrate a lot more debate on a subject. And I would say after Trump, like, it cannot do that. Even before Trump, it was already going away. There was simply no debate. And uh, and paradoxically, or rather not paradoxically, but to be expected, predictably, society is more polarized. Now he says, yes, society is more polarized. I'm going, like, yeah, it's more like, you just literally told me that you have freedom of expression in Canada. You've agreed that actually the debate is only one-sided, where you argue about the finer details, not the goals, and that it's producing more polarization. And like none of this is kind of sinking in. You know what I mean, right? Like, um, this is why I think the Russian narrative is so important for them. Is by blaming people who disagree with the government on Russia, and this was going on for years, even before the war, what they're saying is our methodology of stifling debate is not what's driving the polarization. Because again, we have stumbled on self-evident truth, universal truths that cannot be argued with, right? So, I would say, I mean, you're just talking about your civic religion. I don't care about your civic religion.
Yes,
So,
I believe in your immortal words. It was probably about late 2020, early 2021. You said something along the lines of, "I am a convid atheist. I will go through the motions. I do not believe in any of this, though."
yes, yes, yes. I literally told people that just to make them angry. I said, I'm not afraid of COVID. I'm not even sure it's real, but I wear the mask. I go along, but I don't take it seriously at all. I said, I'm just going along to get along. That would make people fucking irate. Irate. Because literally, I was wearing their religious symbol, the mask. And I was telling them I'm an atheist. And like, I drove one guy who was a driver, and he went ballistic. You are effing ignorant, man. And I mean, I got reprimanded for that. But
So you were like that one Jesuit priest who's always like posting like the pro gay marriage stuff.
for in their world, yes.
Perfect, perfect.
I, I was I was unbelievably subversive. I was unbelievably subversive, and I got reprimanded again, and I had to sign papers basically
Well, you heard it
saying
here,
no
folks.
more COVID jokes because I made another joke. As long as this is going to be kind of like, I think we're going to do like an easygoing stream. We'll get to the news, but
Yeah, I do have plenty to cover, but I'm liking this unexpected detour. But you heard it here, folks. You got to be a Jesuit to the state civic religion.
so this one time I'm working away, and in my department there's like at least 5 or 6 other people, and at one point I just stopped and I banged the table. This was like autumn last year, and I said, "Damn it! When is this uh, COVID? When is this vax die off going to happen?" So, so here I am, saying, like, unlike the anti-vaxxers who want to stop the vaccine because it will kill people, I'm an anti-vaxxer who was looking forward to a mass die-off of the vaccinated.
Which, of course, we would never believe in because we accept all
No, no,
official
it's a
narratives.
joke. I there was so much stress after like a year and a half of it. People in the room cracked up. I mean, they laughed so hard. It was hilarious.
That's Macedonian trolls. You thought they
We're
were just a
born to troll.
it's an entire nation full of them. 2 million of them.
So anyways, I think that's it's important to bring this up because this is the kind of mentality that is like, essentially supporting the war. So like, I think COVID in many ways showed just how, like, I'll give him that. It's just how resilient the empire is. Even though I told them, I said, essentially, I said, you can look at countries like Sweden and Denmark. One had lockdowns, the other one didn't. They had the same excessive death rates, the same size population. Didn't make a difference. I said, it's not a deadly disease because, like, the average age of death is 83.5 in Canada, which is 5 years more than the average age of death in Canada. And I go to him, you know what that means? And he goes, what? I go, getting COVID literally extends your life by 5 years. So I do make him laugh from time to time. He doesn't expect this nonsense, right? So uh, I said the whole point of it, I said, was to create, because we did it. We spoke about this on the show last year, that it created a friend enemy distinction, right? And so I'm telling him about this, and I'm telling him about the podcast that we do, and so on and so on. Don't worry, he doesn't remember it. I would never even tell him. And I said, um, you know, once I said, you know, how people feel about the mandates, the the heavily coerced vaccinations. You know, you get this vax or you lose your job. I had a cousin that could not graduate without getting her vaccine, and uh, you know, I said that created that let the population know that there was, you know, a certain percentage that after 2 years of propaganda of being almost exclusively the only news item, it was about, you know, depending on the country, somewhere between 15 to 8% of the population was just non-compliant, just would not go along with it. And I said, I always knew that it would overlap into, would there be an invasion of Ukraine? If there's a war, who would support it? And I said, like, resistance or unwillingness to support gay in the war in Ukraine. Most of that resistance would all come from the anti-vaxxers, anti-COVID measures. So that means people who got the vax but still didn't like the measures. It's nuanced, but generally people against all the COVID stuff, right? And so he's listening, and I said what was really amazing was in first week of March, I said I listened to a guy named Academic Agent, and what's funny is he brought this up the same a few months later after I was saying it, and he saw an overlap, and I saw Canadian statistics that showed this. I said, so in a sense, the civilization is preparing for a showdown, and they want to know like how much of the population is. COVID was not an emergency. It was not the emergency that people wanted it to be, but it was important to believe that it was in order to see how much faith people had in the system and how much compliance and fear they had of the system, right? I'm sure he doesn't buy any of this whatsoever. And I said, you know, in the Canadian study and the British study, both said exactly what I was saying, that the greatest resistance would be anti-vaxxers. Not all the anti-vaxxers, about, you know, 40% of them took Ukraine's side, but the strongest resistance comes from there. That's where the biggest numbers come from.
Well, I think it'd be
And
interesting
I
to
said, it's
see
because
now
it's,
that we're almost 5 months into it, how opinions have changed, and because I just speaking from personal experience, a lot of people who are in these spheres who may have had even just some more sympathy towards Ukraine's are, and even if they're not like so-called pro-Russia now, they're just completely stay out of it. They really don't care about the fate of the conflict. They just don't want
yeah,
40 billion more dollars going over weekly. So I am curious to see like updated statistics, even though I doubt we could ever get those.
yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, at one point he did say, I respect your opinions. I don't think you, I mean, I've known him for 30 years, so I don't think he was just uh, being kind, but I think he does, he does like being challenged, even if he doesn't agree. Um, anyhow, I just thought that that was, you know, it's just somebody I haven't seen since December and somebody I've known for a long time. And I will say that this war has, like, there are people that, you know, whatever little disagreements we've had, like on a subconscious level, I think we know each other what side they've taken. And there's just less and less communication about it, right? Like this war does have, it is like COVID, it is divisive. It does show friend and enemy distinction, because I have at least two other friends that are like this, right? And in some ways, like life and the events in life in our society have developed in such a way. Up until this point, there weren't really issues that could really divide us, and yet they're here now. And that it is these issues that have like really revealed what a person's worldview and faith in religion are.
It's certainly one of those things where it really tells you what side you are on. I think to a lesser extent, the repeal of Roe and the fallout from that over the past couple months has also been one of those items. But again, people got caught in this loop, especially people around my age or so that this is like the first time in centuries that anything of significance has happened, and that the world was just in this like state of calm equilibrium before then, not just like this was like a 30 or 40 period of relative calm. But I do think you bring up a good point that again it does show the dividing line, especially on a civilization that is, um, you know, love or hate the fact on its last legs, and it really tells you, uh, how people feel about that, what cope they're about to have about it. And just to revisit the story you were telling me about, you know, that you just told us right now, it is an interesting pivot of these people who would have otherwise decried the direction of the West was going, even, for example, when Trump got elected in 2016, now proclaiming to be its greatest champions and proclaiming how strong and stable it is in the face of an external threat such as Russia or China. So there is a lot of interesting narrative
Right.
shifts going on where they, maybe they don't believe in it on a conscious level, maybe they don't really believe in it on a subconscious level, but they fundamentally accept, no matter what, that in order for their ideas to work, in order for their worldview to make sense, this has to be true.
Right. I mean, this is a guy that I told 8 years ago. Back then, he was uh, more or less just, he didn't really buy it, but he was very curious. And I said, this is like late 2014 and early 2015. I said, you're going to see more division in the West. You're going to see more measures that block out contrarian points of view. Uh, you're going to hear more talk about civil war. I even named names. I said, you're going to see in certain articles about young men reading Julius Ella, Oswald Spengler. All of those things have come to pass, by the way. Okay. All of those things have come to pass. So I was saying this in like early autumn 2014. And, um, he was intrigued by it. But as things have kind of ramped up, he's taken aside. And I've had conversations with him. I go, you haven't, I said, we've discussed this subject for 8 years and you've never been able to predict anything. Anything. It's all it'll correct itself, or why is that important? I said, like, he's an artist. I go, you're an artist. Like, you, how is it that you can't even come up with a good argument why it's not important, other than, oh, it's been through this before, so it won't mean anything. It's like, well, there were a lot of civilizations that went through things, and eventually the civilization still died out. His opinions now are kind of like I guess what I'm saying, I'm echoing kind of like there's a greater amount of fear, uh, 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 and that's what.
And with that being said, that was an unexpected tangent, but I still think we did get a lot out of that, and I do think it's worth exploring these sort of topics. But
Yeah.
I do have some other news. Again, not to cut you short or anything, but some news regarding Syria before we get into the stuff regarding particularly Europe, but also Russia and Ukraine as well, and also the news about former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe meeting an untimely demise that I really want to go through and pick apart some of the details we know about that now, but we'll leave that alone for now. And, that may tie back into Syria, and those of you who know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about. But out of Syria, it looks like yet again the continuance of the pressing into northwestern Syria by government and pro government forces has continued. There's been shelling. Of course, there were Israeli strikes. In the pocket in the southwest, still controlled by the opposition, as you can see, there were coalition drills there, training, of course, local forces. The SDF forces out of Afrin were saying between the actions of the Syrian government and the possible actions of the Turkish government, that the SDF should prepare for a quote unquote 0 hour as time goes on, and that the SDF probably will have to face off against either one or both of these forces. Now, again, we've discussed this in the past few episodes here about the SDF and their position and their state sponsors. And as opposed to 2018, 2019, the U.S. is a much less reliable partner. Not that it was even a reliable partner in 2018, 2019, but even much more so now. The U.S. is a very unreliable partner. They have been the historic guarantor of this. The Syrian government seems to, at this rate, slowly but surely, I know it's been a while since we've had the map up, clean up these areas, these pockets of resistance. Now, of course, you can see where some of these ISIS and these ISIS affiliates have popped up in eastern Syria, as has been happening for the past 2 years. There's been spontaneous attacks, but it seems that most of the action is currently focused in northwestern Syria. Of course, there have been the occasional Israeli strikes on it, and Israel in its own set of political turmoil right now. And we're still awaiting the Turkish operations. And it looks like, you know, I want to take a moment, and I don't want to gloat too much at least, that looking at this map right now, the last summer of Idlib is actually a really, like, plausible prediction. Something I have gone out on a limb for months now. Like, when I made the prediction, it was somewhat plausible. Then, after a while, it just dragged on. It dragged on. It became something like that. Oh, that's never going to happen. Especially when Ukraine broke out and Russia pulled most of its force out of Syria to focus on Ukraine. It's never going to happen. Syria is going to remain a stalemate for however long. And I stuck to it on principle because I made my dedication, and I said I have to stick by my opinion, even if I have doubts about it, because I've already made my call. But I do think what we're seeing right now, especially with Russia moving forces back in, with a less involved United States, and again, I'm just rehashing arguments that I made last episode, and with the potential of a Turkish intervention, I do believe what is happening here is Syria and its allies, whether that be the militias on the ground, whether that be Iran, whether that be Russia, want to strike preemptively and clean up what they can out of Idlib in northwestern Syria before any major Turkish actions happen. Now, any major Turkish actions will probably be focused against the SDF, but that doesn't guarantee they won't take any actions against the Syrian government itself. They'll be more hesitant to do so, but as we've seen in the past, they're not entirely hesitant to disengage from Syrian forces when need be. But I doubt it will be a direct incursion into solidly controlled Syrian forces controlled territory by the Turks. And I could be wrong about that. I don't think Turkey's willing to risk that at this point unless somebody in Washington is putting extreme pressure on them to intervene in Syria to bog Russia down there, which is a possibility in light of the whole back and forth with Turkey and NATO. And there's just brief news I'll mention right here because there isn't much out of it, but Turkey is threatening to renege on its pledge to admit Sweden and Finland into NATO because criteria, particularly regarding the extradition of people who are considered terrorists by the Turkish state, has not been fulfilled yet. So Turkey is threatening to pull that out. So it's entirely possible that what Turkey is at least threatening to do in Syria is part of some greater deal with NATO and the U.S. But again, since nothing has happened yet beyond actions by Turkish proxies, you can't really speculate too far into that. But the main news out of Syria this week and over the past several weeks is that northwestern Syria is slowly but surely being encroached upon. That pocket along the Jordanian border, because that is still the hub of coalition forces, still has not been touched. And just out of Middle Eastern news in general, which I think will set the tone for the rest of the show here, there is an interesting statement from Khomeini that, and I quote, "The arrogant West has become weaker by the day in our region, more recently throughout the world. The failure of the United States and its criminal accomplice, the Zionist government, can clearly be seen in the recent events in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan." So those are words from Khomeini regarding the current situation in the Middle East and the current situation in the world in general. So I do think that sums that up pretty well, regardless of what you think. I think the man is speaking entirely factually that the United States has had a string of failures just in the past 5 years alone, 10 years alone, if you want to even go that further back. But it's no surprise, and again, I do speculate that, again, the cleaning up in Syria is on top of the relative success Russia has had in Ukraine, and to anticipate any actions in the Middle East that may be used to bog down Russia in a second front.
Mhm. And now that you've brought up Iran, what we should also mention, you just reminded me of it, is two British diplomats have been detained now by Iran. They were caught in the countryside, kneeling down, taking soil samples, and what they're afraid of is that they're taking soil samples to like investigate, suppose whether Iran is developing nukes or not. Um, I mean, it could be spurious. I don't know. I don't care. I'm interested in the power play that it is, and they published photos of these diplomats blindfolded and being taken away in an SUV. So they are now ostensibly in prison. Uh, the other news that's coming out is now Russia has figured out with Iran and India a new transport route. And so now goods from Russia go down like the Volga and they go into the Caspian Sea and down the Caspian Sea to Iran. Iran then takes the stuff to the Persian Gulf and then delivers it to India. So they've been now transporting grain and some other items like that. This completely cuts off any interference from the West. And first of all, it's much quicker. This is a much shorter route. And that's a very interesting development. So we're seeing more cooperation. Of course, Iran has accepted the Mir card, as has India and China and Argentina. The number of countries is growing, and maybe also to make a quick zigzag back to what you were talking about with Turkey and the incursions into Syria. Now, I don't want to go out on a limb and say that Turkey's going to launch something major, but to be fair, threatening to launch something major. These are small incursions, pinpoint attacks, but he's also losing men as well. Just this week, four regular Turkish troops were killed in an attack by Kurdish forces. So I don't see necessarily the confidence there. And furthermore, he's in Syria and in urban warfare, it's very hard to extricate your enemies without some kind of reconnaissance and some kind of air force, airbound reconnaissance, that is, right? So I don't see it yet. And him maybe taking the Mir card is an indication that this is going to be, I don't know, like it could be another play by Erdogan here. Uh, it just could be him being ineffectual. Turkey's economy is going to depend more and more on Russia and China going forward. And the other big news is for a couple of days, Turkey stopped a Russian grain shipment, but it released it yesterday. So that shows to me a certain level of cooperation that he's still willing to do. The problem is too for him is if he starts killing a lot of Kurds. I'm not saying that the state would be like overwhelmed with grief. Certainly, the Pentagon would have an easy day because it wouldn't even make the news cycle. However, I think for the strategy of tension over a prolonged period of time, which is the game that the U.S. is playing in Syria, him wiping out the Kurds there would be problematic for America. Like nobody would. So I don't know how invested he really is in this.
Yes, I would concur that there is that possibility as well, that it could just be again, something he's actually not too interested in. That a lot of this is bluff, just for internal popularity purposes. But something I did want to mention, because you did bring up the North-South corridor, is that you alluded to it, but I figure it's worth hammering the point home that the idea of trade via the high seas is not, of course, it's far from obsolete, but it's being circumvented more and more every day and with each passing year. And it does remind me actually of the Suez Canal blockage from about uh, a year and some change ago. That was March 2021. The Suez Canal was blocked up for about, I think it was 9-10 days. And we had said during the time of the show, in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way, that I bet this will encourage Eurasian land trade and play well to the Belt and Road with the canals getting clogged. Now we haven't had a similar instance when it came to the Panama Canal, which is the other major canal in the world, and not that those are the only two, but there's like the two big ones, as it were. But as the distinctly American-controlled seas are in charge of an American empire that is more and more on the ropes. And as we've discussed previously, this is an American fleet that will most likely become more mercenary like, if not resorting to just outright high seas piracy. We've seen this at points in the
Yeah.
past. We've seen this in 1988 when it waged a minor naval war against the Iranians in the Persian Gulf. We saw it in 2019 when we did that on a much smaller scale, when we would intercept these tankers. And at this rate, when it comes to enforcing these sanctions, I'm not speculating anything in particular, but maybe against Russia or maybe in a future dispute with China when it comes to enforcing sanctions, it could be that we do see ships involved in the trade for that, which, again, you've seen over the past, 15 years, especially in China, a focus on naval expansion. Now, the American Navy on paper is still the strongest in the world. However, pointing to the 2018 war games in both the South China Sea and Baltic Sea war game simulations, they did lose handily to China and Russia, respectively, despite having the theoretical advantage. And that is thanks largely to the innovations in missile technology by Russia and China, the so called hypersonic missiles. So, you've seen investment in that. You've seen investment in just the fleets of Russia and China as well. I mean, you've even seen the British and the French invest in their own fleets at this rate, and they are solidly within the sphere of the American empire, despite whatever rhetoric may come out of those two. And again, we have plenty of news about what's happening in Europe and what's happening with Boris Johnson that we'll get into in a moment. But it is worth looking at a lot of these land routes that are being established. I would say mainly the Belt and Road, and then the north-south corridor, the pipelines as well, despite Russia's current disputes with Europe. That these land-based transportations are becoming all the more crucial, and you're seeing the rapid development of these over the past several years because the American Navy does control the seas. It has historically enforced a modicum of neutrality in order just to, again, keep tensions lower in the world. I'm not going to say low as a whole, but lower at least. And with that, again, as the American empire slips, it's a matter of time. I mean, I could see a Trump 2.0 in 2024 wanting to leverage naval control of the seas against, let's just say, so-called rogue countries, against countries that don't obey the will of the United States. Now, this could get as severe depending on how far relations deteriorate and how far the state of the world deteriorates, where it could come to outright blockades and like hard naval power. But I imagine there's going to be a lot of soft naval power where, and I would argue it exists today, but I think it's going to become a much more blatant threat that if you defy the United States, that your access to the seas is not guaranteed. Which, I mean, will only play into the hands of course, these countries like Russia and China that are focusing on land trade routes and on their own alternative control of the sea. And of course, Russia and China have invested greatly in travel in the Arctic Sea as well. So you see, once again, these parallel systems evolving across the world. This rise of multipolarity. I know it's done to death, but point being is, I think within the next few years especially, control of the seas being a much more contentious issue is going to have to be something that we look at.
Yeah, I mean, now that you bring up multipolarity, my friend actually scoffed at the idea. There isn't multipolarity. And then he says there are two different systems that are emerging. Well, I mean, that's the same thing. Like, what you know what I tend to think this is, right? It's kind of like when CNN said that Kiev's going to fall in 96 hours, right? That was to set up a false expectation because they knew it wouldn't. They knew that Russia never even had enough forces for that to happen. What Russia was hoping basically would be a court coup. Essentially, Zelensky's team would overcome the nationalists, and a deal would be reached. That's my guess. Um, it works much the same way, right? Uh, Russia is really trying to take over all of Europe, right? So they're already preparing for like a victory that like Russia only turns Ukraine into a rump state, which I think is why like for him, the West is stronger than ever because it's united because they honestly believe like if they weren't so united, Putin would go to Berlin again, maybe Paris. I'm not kidding. I have literally spoken to people who really believed that. They really, honest to goodness, believe that. It's so insane, but they do. Um, which is also a way of not taking Russia's security interests seriously. It does a very good job of that too. I mean, I must say, like the narrative spinning is really quite remarkable. The lies within lies is something to behold. But I don't want to go off on this tangent any more than I already have.
Yes, but I do think you bring up once again good points. And before we get into the minutia minute involving Ukraine, I do want to cover the news out of Europe. So Boris Johnson, after literal scores of ministers had resigned from his government, has finally announced his resignation pending the nomination of a successor. Now, this is similar to Theresa May's resignation, where she said she would step down as soon as the party coalesced and decided on who the next prime minister was going to be, because the Conservatives still do have a mandate for government. This isn't going to call a snap election or anything, so they could decide the next prime minister. And it seems like of all the candidates, there's not one native to the British Isles to be found. It's all it seems to be Indian and Pakistani names are the ones that keep coming up, and as I'm sure you know from Boris Johnson's government, those were rife.
Mm.
Those were to be found, and of course, they are one of the largest immigrant groups to the UK. So it could be the case. I mean, Ireland actually beat them to it naturally by having their prime minister be a half Indian man, because of course Irish identity is set on being
And
the
gay.
opposite of. Oh yes, yes, he was. He was an LGBTQIA half Indian man. But as we know, Irish identity is focused on being whatever the British is not. So if the British haven't gotten in on the rainbow diversity prime minister, they need to beat them to it. So I suppose the Irish do win that. What a proud nation built on traditional
Yeah.
European Catholic values, as you know, the Ireland we all know and love. But it's actually quite sad. I mean, Ireland. Just not to go on too much of a tangent. I remember, well, I kind of remember, but I just looking back, you look through the news reports, especially the way American media portrayed it. It portrayed it as if it were the Catholic version of Iran, and today,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in just over the course of a decade, it had gotten to this. Now, Ireland turned itself into a haven for international corporations with its loose tax laws, so one could argue it invited on itself. And not to get too much off on the Irish, but I do think that warrants more discussion. The Irish don't get much discussion on this show because Ireland really just doesn't do that much on the world stage. That's just how it goes. But Boris Johnson is out. The Conservatives are still in power in the UK. It doesn't look like an election is going to be called anytime soon, as the last election was in December of 2019. And it does create an interesting situation in the UK because for years the Labour Party has been really just Corbyn, and I know there's been movements to remove Corbyn. I think they finally did get him out of the leadership position of the party.
Yeah.
But the Conservatives have been in power in the UK since 2010, and they would win consecutive larger majorities because they had the general election in 2010, which brought Cameron in. Then he was re-elected in 2015, which brought about Brexit, all of that. May takes over after Cameron's resignation, agrees to carry out Brexit. May has an election in 2017 to legitimize her position in power, which actually does increase the conservative seats yet again. Then in 2019, she, with tears in her eyes, resigns because she couldn't hold it up, which leads to Boris Johnson coming to power. Boris Johnson decides he's going to do the exact same thing, call an election, in order to have the legitimacy of the people behind him to have the mandate. And it seems like out of all the politicians, Johnson seemed to have been a genuine believer in the democratic system that, well, if the people voted for me, I get to do this, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know what that says about his character or how that influences any of your opinion of him, but I do think that's an interesting note that he seemed to, at least on the surface, be a true believer in the system insofar as that's concerned. He eventually got Brexit done, so he did fulfill that campaign promise as of that. Then there were the lockdowns, which he was up there with some of the most severe restrictions when it came to that. He got busted breaking his own rules, him and his ministers did, on top of just a slew of crises between this, the economic fallout, and the war in Ukraine, of course, him trying to say, well, I have to stick it out before he, finally threw in the towel. I have to stick it out for the sake of Ukraine because Ukraine needs allies in the West, and going to visit Zelensky, and Zelensky was all sad about him going. And naturally, the stories about Johnson's mismanagement and Johnson's failures were pinned on Russia because, and it's wild because I know ever since Trump got elected, it is to blame the Russians. That's a very easy get out of jail free card when it comes to wanting to attack your political opponents. But Boris Johnson, just by heritage alone, he is a British man who has Circassian and Russian Jewish ancestry. And his entire political career, in fact, he was foreign minister before he was prime minister. He has been stalwartly anti-Russia. He's been pro-NATO expansion. He has been, again, really in line with the regime on this, and even he gets slandered as the Russian agent. People wanted desperately to portray him as the British Trump, and he is once again out for good or for ill. Now, I know Boris Johnson actually did have some goodwill with more of the uh, populist right or distant right, or however you would like to term that, that was quickly squandered away after every consecutive action that he took. And some of his rhetoric actually ran left of the Labour Party at times, according to British
Yes.
people I had talked to about this, where he wanted to do this. Of course, his most recent big statement before his resignation was about, well, if women were just in charge of Russia, this wouldn't be a problem. So I'm sure you all recall that. We covered that an episode or two ago. But with this, he leaves in disgrace with no clear successor. And at least when May resigned, and May resigned with much less pressure to resign, there was a relatively clear idea that it was going to be Boris or one or two other people that were going to succeed her. So there was a clear line of succession there. When May took over from Cameron, there was a clear line of succession. And at this point, there's about 5 or 6 different candidates whose names I have not committed to memory because ultimately I think whoever ends up taking power in the UK is going to be inconsequential when it comes to the current state of the world. Now, maybe internally within the UK, I would imagine it would make a difference, but insofar as we're concerned, I don't see it making that profound of an impact. I doubt the UK is going to back out of its support for Ukraine or its support for any of these other projects of the American empire. But I really don't see a way with this unless the conservatives find somebody who can, again, at least satiate their at least segment of the population. I really don't see a way out of this
Hmm.
without another election being called soon. And again, that would
Yeah.
be an election in 2017, an election in 2019, an election either 2022 or 2023. And of course, this is on top of a lot of turmoil in the major countries of Europe, both inside the European Union and outside the European Union in the case of the UK. There's the case of the Dutch farmers, which we'll get into in a moment, as well as sort of spillover for that, movements that have been inspired by that, and also keeping in mind that Macron lost his legislative majority no less than a month ago at this rate. And again, that was after he was, at least according to the results of the second round, handily reelected against Le Pen. Now, of course, with the French system, with the two-round system, it does lend itself to this sort of landslide. So even if a candidate is not popular, they can do it by just being a modicum less more popular than the other candidate, or fear mongering about the other candidate, such as Macron did twice. However, it is funny because just revisiting the French legislative elections, Le Pen's party, uh, I believe they're National Rally now. They used to be Front National, but uh, same group, different name, whatever. Were the ones who actually saw the big gains in that election, on top of the harder left wing parties, even the left wing parties that would be, for example, Eurosceptic and sort of like the old left, as it were, um, much more socialistic, not in like the buzzword sense, but in the real sense. So Macron lost ground to both the left and the right, being the radical centrist that he is. You have Johnson resigning with no clear successor and no big names behind him. You have the Dutch farmer protest and the spillover from that. But if you have any thoughts in the UK, I'll hand it over to you. If not, we can move on to the details of the Dutch protests.
Yeah, no, all I'll say about Boris Johnson is, as time goes on, I think some machinations are kind of easier to read. And I've said it before, I think it bears repeating that obviously, Brexit was, I mean, he begged to suspend government during the Brexit vote from the Queen, and he was denied. So we shouldn't think that he wasn't like a weasel and wanted to find his way into power one way or another, and could compromise Brexit anyhow. That said, you know, I think Brexit in and of itself was. Um, I think it's an. I think it's partly like it was an American thing. It was British as well. A lot of people were pissed off, but the people who wanted Brexit didn't get what they wanted, right? I think they wanted a weaker EU, and with the big three wealthy nations of the EU were the UK, Germany, and France, and so all these other little countries that depend on handouts from the EU uh, are going to lose, like, let's say, one third of their wealth or 25% of their wealth, because a lot of these countries, they depend on big loans, big IMF loans, right? And it was sufficient to weaken the EU first in order to bargain and push the EU, particularly Germany, to abandon Nord Stream 2, and also to gain compliance for the war in Ukraine. And this is why I think he wanted such a leadership position for the war in Ukraine. His whole nonsense about global Britain, the Quad, and all this other nonsense, right? Which is all too little, too late, because none of these countries have a military or a military capacity to really do anything about it. Those days are gone. Britain's military force is considerably smaller and weaker than it was during the Falkland Wars. So um, that's all I wanted to say. Just it's something to keep in mind as we're talking about Boris Johnson.
Yes, and we could go on all day about Brexit, and in retrospect, it does seem to be something that was to fuse not only the British closer to the core of the American empire, but also in a way make the European Union in put it in a position where it would have to be in a more dependent relationship with America as
Yes,
well.
exactly.
Um, which again, I'm happy to see the UK leave the EU for internal reasons. Just the British people I know, just describing the reasons why they would have voted to leave or the reasons why they did vote to leave. I like that, of course. I do think that insofar as Europe is concerned, not having a British voice at the table is highly beneficial. In fact, you actually look at the European Parliament, not that the European Parliament is this great institution that will really change the game, but there was actually a massive rightward shift as the MEPs from the UK were removed as the UK left the Parliament. So that was one benefit that came out of it. It also did cause panic within the European Union. It allowed voices like Orban, who admittedly was strong before Brexit, to get even stronger. It allowed a brief populist
Mm-hmm.
wave where you saw a rise in Le Pen, you saw a brief populist government in Italy, you saw a brief populist government in a few of these other smaller nations. You saw the rise of the anti-establishment Eurosceptic parties in countries like Germany. Of course, Poland, whatever you think of law and justice, they have been a thorn in the side of it. So it has allowed some fires to be stoked within the European Union. And for that, I think it was a good thing. But ultimately, I do think it was a rearranging of power structures, as it were, in order to consolidate things more as they look to the future. Because, of course, the Brexit vote took place in 2016. This was after the annexation of Crimea. This was after Russia began its intervention in Syria. After Iran seemed to be on the ascent as with Syria, China on the ascent as well. So it did look like that at least the strategic planners of the Obama era American empire and just them and all their affiliates in Europe, outside of Europe, whatever, it looks like that may have been part of the plan, which may seem strange on the surface. I'm not saying that Brexit was a complete false flag, as it were, but I do think there were elements of that, and I do think there was a lot they could reap out of it. And despite what I listed in terms of the collapse of the European Union, it hasn't made that much of a dent on stability. Although for a few years it was interesting because after the UK left, or was in the process of leaving, you did see with Macron of all people. Wasn't when Macron was doing that strange pivot in 2018, 2019, trying to be more conciliatory towards Russia, and again also withdrawing from Syria, having those summits in Istanbul with France, Germany, Russia, and Turkey in regard to a peace summit in Syria. So you did get some machinations out of that that I think a UK having a seat at the table, or a full seat at the table because they were still within the withdrawal process at the time, would have prevented. So I did, just as far as Brexit is concerned, a lot of good did come out of it, even from our point of view. But at the end of the day, I do think it was probably one of their many internal machinations. But moving on to the Dutch farmers. The Dutch farmers have been protesting, of course, some of the new environmental regulations. Now, the Netherlands has always been a country that has been at the forefront of environmentalism. Always one of the countries that's it's always going to be underwater in 10 years, and it has been since, of course, the 1990s. So they put restrictions on their farmers. I'm sure you know the story. The farmers protest because it's a direct threat to their livelihoods. Police crack down, but it was a rather violent crackdown, even insofar as like these things are concerned. Because you can recall, for example, the Seville protests. I know that's nowhere on the same scale, or J6 in the U.S., or the trucker protests. Like, I'm not saying that there weren't like forceful crackdowns, but you had the government use live ammunition on some of these protesters. Just,
Yep.
like again, they were blocking the street, which wow, we've never seen that one before. They had their tractors out in convoys, but it was a hard and fast crackdown on these protesters, and this has spawned similar movements, not necessarily related to farming issues, but just grievances with European governments over the past 3 to 5 years, I suppose you could say. In Germany, in Italy is another big one, and in Poland have been with other small protests across European Union countries as well. But those are the big ones that are currently taking place, and this is on top of very bad economic news for Europe. On top of everything that's been going on, it's just been exasperated. Nord Stream 2 is set to shut down at the beginning of next week for a 10-day maintenance, and that
Nord
is
Stream 1.
after yes, Nord Stream 1, excuse me, is set to shut down for routine maintenance from July 11th to July 21st, and that's on top of countries waffling back and forth on sanctions. I know that like there was some fertilizer sanctions that I believe it was in Germany they were trying to make an exception for because it was just that dire of a situation that they needed it. As you were mentioning at the beginning of the show, these countries have resorted to burning coal. I bet you can imagine who one of the biggest coal producers in Europe is. That would be the Russians as well.
Yeah.
Um, so things, there are no real unique problems in Europe going on currently, but it's just an exasperation of the ongoing problems, and it reached a breaking point in the Netherlands, at least with the farmers. Now, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we have any Dutch experts or any Dutch people in the audience, agriculture is not a major sector in the Netherlands, but I mean, sometimes it
It
takes.
is actually.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
huge.
Uh, okay, then I do stand corrected. I just figured the farmers in South Africa, but I digress. But um, I always assumed it was. I Of course it wasn't insignificant in fact in the light of these protests, but I always just assumed, just going in on it, that it was a smaller but more like cohesive sector. But apparently it is a large sector of the economy, so I'll take your word for it. Pardon my ignorance there, but uh, naturally that has led to this right here. And a lot of people are tying this back to WEF policies, Klaus Schwab, the usual, of course, which I'm not doubting that those aren't elements involved. But they've been pushing this sort of stuff for years. I know Schwab and the WEF, in light of the whole Great Reset thing, have gained a new level of infamy. Not that it's unwarranted, but I do think it's more so a combination of the economic factors spurred on by the war and the sanctions therein, and the harebrained schemes coming out of Davos that really came together to create the perfect storm in the Netherlands that is also seeming to spill over across the continent. And one thing I will say, just as a pure speculation, the Yellow Vest movement is dormant, but as I understand, not dead. Because I mean that went on for a good part of a year, almost an entire year. It was really the convent stuff, excuse me, that did shut it down at the beginning of 2020. So
Hmm.
there is, I would imagine, a lot of latent energy in France that is willing to burst. And again, there's dissatisfaction with the government, as evidenced by the recent election results in the legislature. So I can imagine that as conditions continue to get worse in Europe, these sort of actions will continue. Now, I doubt this will lead to any major change offhand. You may see a shuffling of governments. You may see some prime minister resignations, some snap elections called. But this isn't anything that's really going to shake the regime to its core. But it is enough to show that there is a fundamental level of great dissatisfaction on the European continent right now.
There is, and these protests, of course, there are some parallels with the Canadian truckers. Some have argued that they're better organized. Uh, in many ways, they have maybe even more to lose. Uh, they're 30% cutback. Now, the argument is the back and forth of this is that there's nitrogen or uh, nitrogen compounds like in other forms, particularly in fertilizer, and it's having effects on wet waterlands, inland waterlands, marshes, that kind of thing, rivers. So that's the reasoning, right? And then there's the argument, well, it's actually not that bad. Um, the Netherlands is not a huge country. It does have an enormous agricultural product export. It's one of the biggest. And probably why it's being able to do that is because it has, first of all, it has very good farmers. It's been a tradition. You notice a lot of these guys who are protesting, they're young, and these are farmers. And as someone who has, let's say, roots in the Niagara area, uh, I'm accustomed. That area is filled with Dutch farmers. My family had a farm, and I remember going to various other farms who were Dutch, who came after World War II, and those families have been there a very long time. Some even before the war. And so, anyways, so it is a real thing. It is a tradition, and the question is now, what are they going to do? Because 30% of our farmers are going to lose their entire livelihoods. They have more to lose. And in that sense, it also reminded me a little bit of the Jan 6 protests. What I mean by this is, a lot of people on our side were saying that the Jan 6 protests was also like a class struggle, and most of them were middle class or lower middle class. Well, those categories were represented. There was also an inordinate amount of professionals, lawyers, former military. Uh, we're talking upper middle class, and could afford to go there. So, one of the things that we've talked about in this show is, especially when we were talking about the early months of COVID in 2020, is the whole point of the lockdown is actually to destroy the middle class, right? And I think that's what's really happening here in 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 the Netherlands. Uh, you can't tell me that these guys are wildlife warriors, and but they're going to burn coal. We have put up with their nonsense about global warming for decades, and now they're burning coal. But you know what? Let's take care of this nitrogen thing. Too much nitrogen. Now, what they're doing is they're going to set up huge, like professional, like corporate run farms. So you're going to see more people who will lose their wealth, and the wealth will be consolidated into smaller hands with much more power, and they're going to be replaced with workers who um, who will be just happy to have a job, and they will comply. And here I'm talking about migrants and
Yes,
refugees,
I was just about to bring that up.
right?
That it likely will
Yeah,
be from outside the country, whether that be uh, just whatever they can scrape up from inside the European Union or outside the European Union as well. That, of
yeah,
course, there will be a lot of people, but that's actually not an angle I've looked at this. No, I haven't looked too much into it. I've just seen what's been happening, but I haven't given it too much thought as of now. I'm still waiting for the situation to unfold, but it's perfectly in line that this is in order to
yeah,
consolidate these farms. A similar thing did happen in the U.S., and you could go all the way even back to the 30s to make that point that when the Depression hit, a lot of these farms were consolidated, and that the idea of the multi generational family farmer has been really eradicated. And once again, while
they have
this
too much independence.
yes, and
They have too much self-reliance.
while this is a story of personal anecdotes, there was a family that grew up the road down the road from me. Very good friends. The son and my older brother were very good friends in school, and I actually had just recently learned that all the farmland they worked is actually land that they are. Uh, I can't remember, either paid to work or land that they rent out. But point being is they don't own the land, and again, like just not to give too much away, uh, they have a big name in farming around here, and you can like see their name on a lot of stuff that's like related to agriculture. And it turns out that they don't even actually own their own land. So, uh, I mean, not to detract too much from the situation in the Netherlands, but this has been a worldwide phenomenon where the small independent farmer as a class has been crushed over the past several decades, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, and really kicking full force, I would say, from the 30s onward in the U.S. And I guess the Netherlands, to my surprise, which I guess shows my level of ignorance about that part of the world, was still a bastion, at least relatively speaking, of the independent farmer to the point where they are cracking down on it now. So I this should come as no surprise to any of you that, of course, they're just trying to consolidate this. Once again, touching on the point of centralized economies, this isn't what a uh, so-called capitalist nation does, and again, that's not even necessarily defense of capitalism in its purest form, but again, this is what a centralized economy looks like. Now, it's not as direct as the commissar coming down and saying your farm is now state property. It's a convoluted thing that, due to you can't meet X, Y, and Z regulations, you can't farm, which leads, of course, you selling the land to some conglomerate that is going to run these massive farms for you, these massive plantations, as it were. And they can have a plantation. Well, I have a plantation. No, I'm sure I've made that joke many times before, so that's probably nothing new here. But I mean, and it is funny making the plantation comparison that they are going to ship in labor from outside the country that they are going to more or less pay just with boarding and basic necessities. Now, I'm sure they will get some sort of official wage, but I mean, most of it. I mean, these people are going to be more or less tenant farmers, so. Um, if you want to start making those comparisons, there's
Yeah.
that it, I mean, maybe not so much as slavery, but I mean, you're having a foreign class of serfs being imported, or you will, and we've seen this in the U.S. with a lot of the Hispanic migration, that a foreign class of serfs is imported to work on what are formerly generational farms.
Right. And you see this in the cycle of civilizations over and over again, especially with Rome. Um, you know, the I think the big takeaway from this is um, what we're, you have that term upward mobility, right? So you're losing upward mobility, right? Whether it's BlackRock buying up houses, so you can only just rent a house. Um, whether it's the Dutch farmers, whether it's the UK government buying up farmland, or the Americans, Bill Gates buying up farmland. It's the same thing essentially, right? Or whether we're talking about the 9 new billionaires that came about in the first year of COVID. We're talking about consolidation of wealth into the higher echelons of political and economic power of the empire, and the control through economic means of the middle. So high and low versus middle. And what's the low? Well, that's BLM. But it can also be representatives of the high, like the idiots from Extinction Rebellion or Greta Thunberg, right? Uh, so that is what's basically happening here, right? They have to consolidate this. Things are going to get really they're streamlining everything, right? Because they know they've been preparing for this very difficult time for I would say at least a decade, if not more, especially with the way things went in Ukraine and the way China has definitely taken Russia's side. Even at the G20 meeting, uh, all those countries, Indonesia, where it was held, China, Iran, Turkey, Argentina. There were a few others, and they all stuck by India. They all stuck by Russia. I don't think even Saudi Arabia. I don't know if Saudi Arabia was there, but they didn't criticize them. So there was no consensus, and that's a pretty big deal, right? And I think that's what the streamlining is also about, right? And that was something that I was even talking years ago, although I couldn't quite express it. I knew that the system was fragile and it would have to go more authoritarian in order to keep itself going. But people who are upper middle class and upper class, they don't see this because it literally will never affect them.
Yes, and that is once again just the way of these power dynamics. And I would agree with you that even if it isn't the best planning, because I don't put that much faith into the planners of the Western governments, as it were, there was still a plan, no less, for these events to unfold in a way, or at least how to respond to these events unfolding. But I suppose that can bring us now to uh, one of the two last big items we have, just a roundup on news out of Ukraine, which once again I will cede the floor to you, as I know you. I know you love this part of the show, and I usually let you do it at the beginning,
I'm
but
not so sure I should keep doing it.
but
The
without
minutia minute.
without further ado,
Yes. So let's begin in my usual direction, which is from the south. So we discussed on the show that the Russians left Snake Island, the very important strategic Snake Island, and a few days later, the Ukrainians dropped the flag with, I believe, a helicopter, and then a couple of days later, they hoisted it. And according to the Russians then shelled and apparently killed some of the Ukrainians that had gone there. Um, the Ukrainians are in a bind right now. They need to show victories. There was a Bloomberg article that came out, in fact, two of them. And the first one was, unless Ukraine can show substantive victories, not a stalemate, but victories, the ability to take back the land that it has lost, support for Ukraine is going to dwindle. And then importantly, despite America giving another 5 billion or so, the EU blocked the transfer of 1.5 billion in military aid and other kind of financial aid to Ukraine, because in their words, we don't believe we will see this money back ever. That's quite an admonition. So now moving us slightly north on the southern coast, in the coastal town of, I believe it's called Ocha, and this is where the Dnieper empties into the Black Sea. It is south of Nikolaev, or the Ukrainians call it Mykolaiv, and it is on the western bank of the river. The Russians have claimed that they hit a barracks there, and casualties could be as high as 300. One of the reasons why they're saying this is through their intercepted messages, these guys were supposed to end up fighting in Donbass, and now they will not be able to. So this is like a little bit bigger than your average battalion. Anyhow, so that is the southern line has been mostly static. There is not much going on there. Ukraine is saying, however, in the Kherson direction, so that's just very slightly on the other side of the Dnieper, is saying that they are going to push for a major attack. If you find some of those maps with the forces that are gathered there, you can see that they are building up forces for a major attack. Now, Ukraine has tried twice before and has failed, and they've lost heavy numbers in the process, big numbers in the process. And one of the difficulties of attacking this area, of course, especially when you don't have air cover, is it's extremely flat, and there are very few, if any, trees. So it's a very difficult place to mount an attack, unless you go with, I don't know, maybe overwhelming force. The two HIMARS were apparently taken out. The Russian Federation military wing displayed the video that they claim are two of the HIMARS being taken out, and that one or two HIMAR missiles were intercepted. Now, the HIMARS, they look basically like, the rockets that you would put on a truck bed, right? And you would fire them. Except these are not really like rockets because they're guided. In that sense, they're missiles. So there is kind of like in linguistics, it would be called a false friend. Anyhow, so they're a similar concept, but they're actually fundamentally different because they can be guided. I don't know if that makes them easier to hit. Who knows? But the southern front has been more or less quiet. And then if we move east and we go into Donbass, there are several small towns that have been taken by the Russians in the last 2 days that are inching towards Bakhmut and Seversk. So Seversk is kind of like a town between Lysychansk and Slavyansk. And a new Gorivka was taken just today. It's along the Severnodonetsk River. On the other side of the river, those are all Russian forces. The Russians will want to go along the river where there is forest, and they will want to move their way towards another town that is just outside of Seversk in order to mount an attack. From what I understand, there will probably not be any major attack or effort for the next 24, maybe 36 hours, maybe 48 hours. So somewhere between a day to maybe 2 days. Probably shouldn't expect anything. But when it happens, I would expect a simultaneous attack from the Ukrainians in the south in order to distract the Russians. Now, speaking of distraction,
of the Russians working in Donbass is the HIMARS are now being used to kill more civilians. In the last 3 days, 4 children have been under 10 have been killed. So this has been an effort on their part, basically to demoralize them. I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think it's working. I think, of course, some of the population will be demoralized, but it's it's not going to work. Um, there's been too much sacrifice. I don't think they know. Like Lugansk itself has lost nearly 2,000 men since January fighting this war on the front. Now you might say that's not a lot, but you're talking a population that's only about a million,
Yeah, that's
million and a half.
compounded with the fact that they've been involved in this war since 2014 as well.
Yes, and so by the way, if you want to learn a little bit more about Lysychansk and the famous Ghost Battalion with Muzagovi, who was the leader who was eventually killed, who held on to to Lysychansk for quite a while, kind of the way Gherkin or Strelkov held for 85 days in Slavyansk. Russians with Attitude, you can find them on the Apple Podcast app, and you can find them on Spotify. It's a free episode, and it's quite funny because there's also some deep lore about how the American Constitution could have had Russians or Ukrainians involved. I don't want to give it away. It's hilarious. I don't think they're being serious.
I haven't heard it yet. I'll certainly have to listen to it. And because you did mention it about the story of the 85 days in Slavyansk, I know that there's a new translation of one of the memoirs out right now.
Yeah,
That's a couple months old. So it's on one of these, off-brand right-wing publisher sites as it is. I can't remember who exactly put it out, but if I can find the link, I'll certainly put it down in the description if you guys want to check that out. I haven't gotten it yet. I want to, but I've heard good reviews, and I can say that much as well.
yeah, it's very interesting. I read it. So that is what is going on in the Donbass area and in the area of Kharkiv. So now we're moving west, northwest. There have been more battles and some severe losses for the Ukrainians as they try to contain this region and at the same time deliver more men to the front lines in Donbass. Also, speaking of Donbass, there was a Belarusian battalion that was severely hit, along with the Georgians. We spoke last week about the Georgians fleeing Slavyansk, who were hit by artillery as they were. Well, it appears that this has also happened with a Belarusian contingent that is working with Russians as well, who are fighting the Russian Federation in Ukraine. So the leader, his name escapes me right now, but he's dead. And I mean, all these guys, if they're ever caught, there will be hell to pay. The first two Azov prisoners sentenced to death have been named. So things are, moving along, but again at a slow and steady pace. And I actually spoke to somebody on Twitter about why is Russia not doing more, especially with regards to the shelling of Donbass. And it would have to increase the numbers, and the Russians are still sticking with this force somewhere between 120 to 160,000 men. If there were more, they could do more, and they could do it more quickly. His argument was about escalation, so that, for instance, when they shell Russian towns like Belogorod,
and Donbass, what they want is an escalation, right? Anything to bring NATO in, and his sort of metaphor that he had. If you're fighting an opponent underwater, the opponent that struggles the most is the one who's going to drown first. Um, uh, make of that what you will. I thought it was an interesting argument. I haven't made up my mind. Um, there's other arguments, for instance, that Ukraine is losing so many troops in the method that Russia is doing that it's keeping the war in Ukraine, and at the same time, it's literally demilitarizing both Ukraine and the West. They know that there's inevitably going to be some kind of a breaking point. Even the mayor of Odessa had said that women might have to be conscripted, that women, young women should be able to be conscripted, but that's just the mayor of Odessa. I don't want to say
Well,
that's
speaking of
nationwide.
conscription, in Western Ukraine, yet again, they are having troubles meeting conscription quotas, and there was one
Yeah.
of a group of people who are just camping out in the woods in order to hide out from being
Yes.
conscripted, and there was one
In
where
Carpathia.
this guy, he was either, I couldn't tell, but like he was either completely naked or mostly naked, just running through the
Mm.
woods, making some sort of like signal call to warn everyone to hide because they were trying to conscript them. And like he, like again, like they had like little smoke signals. I mean, again, they looked like tribal primitives, and that's what they've been reduced to in order to hide out from being sent into the meat grinder in eastern Ukraine. And you see this once again. You saw earlier in the week there were women who were blocking the draft official offices in order to stop them from serving notices to men
Yeah.
in order to conscript them. So in Western Ukraine, particularly in the Zakarpattia or Transcarpathia, depending on who you ask, in that part in particular, as well as the surrounding areas, there is more or less complete revolt against going to fight and die in this war, that they see how fruitless it is. Not to mention the ethnic tensions do play a role in that. A lot of Hungarians, a lot of Rusins, a lot of Romanians, a lot of people who don't necessarily feel that tightly connected to this conflict as well. So I can't imagine that is going to stay contained to the far flung reaches of Western Ukraine at the rate the war is going. You probably will see things like this happen throughout the rest of Ukraine as well. But consistently for the past several months, actually almost like since the war started to look like not in Ukraine's favor, because getting beyond what was initially perceived to be the opening stalemate in the first month or two, again, perceived to be at least, there weren't these problems. But as it became clearer and clearer that Russia is, a world superpower invading a much smaller nation with very poor odds, a lot of these people who weren't necessarily on the best terms with the government in Kiev, especially post 2014 in the first place, have decidedly said they are not going to walk into this meat grinder. And that isn't a surprise. And like I said, it's become a popular movement to the point where even the women at that point, the women still aren't at risk of conscription, as despite the comments of the mayor of Odessa, are saying that no, you're not going to uproot our livelihoods, you're not going to uproot our way of life just so you can take the men of this part of the country and send them off to really just be meat shields and delay the inevitable by however many days or months at that point. So,
Right. And then there's there's the interesting thing, right, about like Western Ukraine where they're trying to conscript. Like Western Ukrainians consider themselves the real Ukrainians, and Central Ukrainians are kind of like half orcs, and then Eastern Ukraine is just all orcs. And that's where they speak like the clean Ukrainian in Galicia instead of there's a term for a kind of mixed Russian Ukrainian, which is such with an S. It starts with an S. Anyways, I forget the name now, but a lot of them feel like, why should I go there? Like, um, Like those aren't even my people. I've literally heard comments like that. They hate them. They despise them. They don't want. Now that said, right? Like a lot of Central Ukrainians and Western Ukrainians, especially some of the elite units, because Pravi sector is from West Ukraine. They have been there, and they're the ones who are telling those in East Ukraine, like they from the Kharkov region that have joined the Ukrainian military. They're the ones that will give them the orders, but they'll bail out because then if things are going bad, you have these Ukrainian prisoners who say we were abandoned, we haven't had food in 2 days, right? It's more the elite units that are and their commanders that are leaving because in a way they feel like they're the ones who are actually carrying the torch. Like the reason for that is when they talk about the towns in East Ukraine, they say like these people who are remaining behind, like they're giving away our positions. They don't want us here. They hate us. Like they hope the Russians come and liberate them. It's interesting admonition.
Yes, and as you were saying, all the way back to 2014, a lot of Western Ukrainians, to a lesser extent Central Ukrainians, were the ones forming these militias and joining the military to go fight in Eastern Ukraine. And they do consider them, once again, part of that Mongol, Turkic, Orcish population, whatever term they want to throw at the Russians for that day, and that they are the true descendants of the Rus. We was Rus and shit, but um, with that being said, they are the elite units, and they will use the people who join up from Eastern Ukraine, from the Kharkov region, from these places, and use them as meat shields, leave them to the dogs, and leave them to bear the brunt of their decisions. So then, to a way, it almost is an ethnic caste system that
Yeah,
is forming, which
yeah,
is interesting.
and
Go
I think
ahead.
they're resentful too because they've lost a lot of their units. Right? We discussed when the war broke out that Ukraine's best troops are all in Donbass. This is not only the heaviest concentration of Ukrainian troops, but their very best troops with the most amount of battle experience and best trained. So I think they feel like resentful, like we've been carrying the weight, now you have to do it. But the dynamic that we were just talking, that has always been there as well. Kind of like you really want to prove you're Ukrainian, then why you should go there. Like you're the ones speaking like a mixed up like half Ukrainian, half Russian language, anyways, etc., etc.
And one last piece I have out of on the ground Ukraine news is that howitzer 155 guns that the French had gifted to the Ukraine for their war effort have been sold to Russia.
Yeah.
Now, this is no advanced piece of military technology. It's not some great game changer. It is just a simple artillery piece. But the Ukrainians who got their hands on it flipped it and sold it to the Russians. And this has been something that's been happening all the way since 2014.
Oh yeah.
Consistently, whenever Ukraine gets this outside military aid, it'll turn around and sell it to whoever, and whoever is usually the Russians at that point. So, um, when it comes to that, there are people who are just pure opportunists, realize that the war is not going in their favor and that there is some profit to be made. But I just had a couple of other pieces involving Russia in general. So
Hmm.
the first one is that Russia is barring Kazakhstan from transporting its oil to Europe, hence exacerbating the energy situation there because, of course, Kazakhstan is in that middle of the road where it is technically on good terms with Russia, but it also is drifting westward. You had the attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan at the beginning of this year, as I'm sure
Yep.
you recall. So Russia has barred that. And also, Russia has ordered several Jewish agencies within the country to cease operations. So
Hmm.
Putin is out there being one of the worst men of the era. Of course, this will cement him in the history book as uh, uh, Putin the Terrible or Vlad the Terrible or however they decide to term him.
He'll he'll never get a coin of his likeness in Israel,
oh no,
unlike Trump.
yeah, all that time spent in Netanyahu, and he's never going to get his coin, or we're never going to have
Yeah.
Putin Heights. But yeah, Putin will be remembered for his pogroms, which shows that as again some of the one of the most elite classes of the empire are both voluntarily withdrawing from Russia and facing pressure on the state to have their organization shut down, it does show that, once again, a more multipolar world is forming, at least along those lines. Now, that's all I had for Russia and Ukraine. I imagine you have expended fully everything you had in your minutia minute. But if not, I will.
I have a little. I do have a little bit more, but
Do go
I'll
ahead.
just say, I'll just add to what you said about the Jewish Agency. That's literally their name, which is like, I guess, the ADL in Russia, but with less power than the ADL has in America. We should remember that the chief rabbi of Russia in Moscow left 2 weeks ago. To not forget that dozens and dozens of Jewish oligarchs, of course, left and landed in Israel on March the 10th, 10 planes full. Now, as I understand it, there's some kind of a negotiation going on, but generally, the article in the Jerusalem Post, what it's saying is that Jews in Russia are very unhappy. They don't like the vast majority are completely against this war. They're on the side, no surprise, on the side of Ukraine. But it still stands no matter what they do. What you're looking at is the pressure of ethnic Russians at the top saying, you don't get behind this, you don't support this, you're going like, and they literally say, Jews are very afraid to speak their minds. And it reminds me of that time in the Soviet Union in the late 50s to the early 70s with the wars in Israel. You had Jewish Russians and Ukrainian Jews in the Soviet Union, who were rising through the ranks, and they were expressing like fondness for Israel, and the non-Jewish Soviets were like, wait a minute, like we're fighting them, and you're doing well. Some of them didn't last long at all. Some of them ran for their lives, but that wasn't going to happen. So a certain amount of compliance is expected. And that's what I think this story is. The main thrust of the story is about. I have only two other things to say about like Russian news, and both of them deal with energy. The first one is the story about Sakhalin Island, which is an island north of Japan and south of the Kamchatka Peninsula. It's this long, long, skinny island. At the bottom are the Kuril Islands. Now, uh, you know, there's been a project that was started by BP way back in the 90s. It took a long time to develop it. Mitsubishi and Miyatsu or Mitsi, another Japanese company, hung on. There was an American company, but it left. Anyways, BP had the lion's share, 55%. And then I think in 2005 or 2006, the Russians said, you sell us 50 plus 1% in this, or we shut the whole thing down. So BP complied. That lowered the number of holdings that the BP had. I think it fell to like 27%. Anyhow, uh, Russia has seized Sakhalin 2. This is a major, major gas development area. It has 3 rigs. It has now the place is prone to earthquakes, so it's quite dangerous. There hasn't been one in a long time, but we are talking about that Pacific Rim in the east, right? And Japan is no stranger to earthquakes, but it is considerably north of it. Anyhow, I don't want to dwell too long because I know Kamchatka has had earthquakes. So there's all kind of piping that has been done and so on, and so Russia now it has ceased it in the sense. Gazprom's holdings have been seized in Germany, and tit for tat, Russia has seized Sakhalin 2, which was a major gas supplier for the Japanese. So they are now like in doo-doo. They will have to figure out where to get their energy needs. And I'm going to imagine that this is going to be like yet one more feather in Russia's cap to be able to sell and have a supply of gas. And as if you think that wasn't enough, Russia has discovered a huge oil deposit, and this is in the Pecora Sea. This is just slightly west of where the Taimyr is. It's like on the Arctic coast, kind of right in the center of Russia. That's where the Pecora Sea is. And apparently, it is 82 million tons of oil. So they will be drilling there. And that is, I promise, all I have on Russia.
Surely a state on the brink of collapse, as I've been assured by many great geopolitical experts.
Hitler is finished. Russia is going to be 5 different countries.
Yes, and with that having been said, we have one last big piece of news. I'm going to hold off on the news out of the absolute overturning of government in Sri Lanka because there's still just so much I can't verify about it that I'm
Yeah.
probably just going to save that for next week. But former Prime Minister of Japan and what would have, and as he was before, of course, his untimely assassination, current member of Parliament of Japan, has been assassinated by a gunman with a makeshift shotgun. And he was giving a speech for a campaign in the lead up to Japanese elections. And he had stepped down in late 2020 for health issues. His party, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is, again, more or less the conservative establishment party of Japan, that has ruled the country with a few exceptions ever since the end of the Second World War. He was assassinated. There still is no motive of from the gunman. The Japanese media or authorities haven't released anything on it yet. I will note a bit of a mixed legacy because he is technically an Assad curse victim. However, however, he was also an advocate of reconciliation with Russia. He had recently said before his untimely demise that the West bore some blame in the outbreak of conflict. So,
Yeah.
again, when it comes to how that curse works, I suppose the Assad curse did actually win out in the end. It is worth noting that everything we've talked about this week that's been so convoluted has been light of the particle acceleration at CERN being activated. So, depending on how much of a tinfoil hat you want to
And
put
we
on,
don't control the curse. Like we're just reporting on the curse.
you,
We don't control the curse.
we don't control it. I am certainly no sorcerer. I've never read the Talmud once in my life. I will have you know. But with that being said, it is conspicuous about his assassination because there's no real motive. He hasn't been in any power. He's certainly in no condition to return to power, as his again with his current health and conditions. I believe he was diagnosed with cancer. So I am trying to really make sense of what the motivations were. Now, given Japan, it could be just something very petty. What we allegedly have from the gunman is he tied him to some cult that was right wing, nationalistic in character, that denied war crimes from Japan and justified the use of Korean women as so called comfort women. That's the most we've gotten out of it so far. For some reason, leftists with nothing better to do act like, again, Mustache Man 2.0 has just died as if he was just some great
No,
threat.
it's ridiculous.
A lot of right wingers are treating him as a martyr, as if he was some great right wing
Yeah,
nationalist.
yeah, I know, I
I
know.
mean, I suppose the best you could say is his policies were on par with Merkel if Merkel were allowed to assert a bit more national interests. So, I mean, on a personal level, which I know it's really pointless looking at politicians on personal levels, compared to everyone in the world, he didn't seem that objectionable. But again, just the circumstance. Again, I'm not willing to read anything greater into this. I can believe it's just some disgruntled gunman who didn't like him as a politician decided to take his chance because he had no other prospects in life. And I only bring it up because it is so widely reported on, and it's so strange that this kind of violence is targeted towards a former prime minister who's just a mere representative in parliament.
Right. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's people who are like on the right, like it's like he's almost as good as Pinochet. Like he's neither or. Like NPR, like criticizing him, like as you say, as if he was like this little Japanese Hitler. It's so ridiculous. He like introduced new I think it was him that made gay marriage legal or like introduced more gay rights. He increased immigration. He criticized the Neets for like not having babies so that they wouldn't need immigrants. I'll give him that. But he really doesn't. It doesn't really fit in either camp. I mean, Japan doesn't decide. Like he wanted to arm Japan. It's like, yeah, that's because America's telling him you better arm. Like, if you think like Japan and South Korea are like really independent states and they decide these policies, like when the Constitution was written by the U.S., like what are you talking about, right? They're not. They have tens of thousands of U.S. personnel there. I'll give you like I have a relative of mine who teaches English, and one of his clients is a Japanese military man in the Air Force, and he's looking to transfer to the U.S. Air Force. It has to deal with retirement benefits and all that kind of thing. Now, where he's situated in Japan, they have these ospreys, and they hate them because they're so loud, and they've moved them to other bases. And he says when the Americans show up and they don't see the ospreys, they demand immediately for those for those ospreys to be flown back, right? That's just to give you a glimpse of like what I'm talking about. But to give you like an antidote of the day to day, let's say. So yeah, the other thing that I learned from that I learned recently about Abe is he did get along with Putin, and they were discussing about trans women's, but ultimately said was Japan is not an independent nation, and I can't give these islands back because ostensibly it would mean trouble with America. So that's why he never gave them back. And those islands are now becoming militarized,
That is interesting,
even
and
though there was a
again, like
shared effort by both countries to develop those islands.
I know that he had a lot of internal support in Japan, but I can only think that really insofar as the outside world is concerned, he will only really be remembered for being assassinated. Because I mean, otherwise, and I know that there might be people with different opinions even in this audience, but ultimately, I consider his term as prime minister rather unremarkable, just from what I know about it.
Right. I mean, I think there isn't really charisma there, and he does seem, I don't know. He's all right. He seems like very, as you say, he's like a Merkel. He's somewhere in the middle. He's their managerial type, and maybe to a native Japanese, he means far more. But I don't get the sense that he has charisma. You know.
I mean, granted, there also is the question of how much charisma plays into, or how much the interpretation of charisma plays into politics in East Asia versus in the Anglosphere in Europe, because again, much culturally different, and just what I know about politics in Asia, like you don't exactly get the like super charismatic figures, at least as we would understand them. Of course, charisma may
You're
carry
right.
a
There is a
different
barrier there.
cultural meaning, but again, as he just seemed like your normal managerial leader. I I don't think he deserved to get blown away, and that's not something I'd say about a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
international politicians. I would never say anything like that about any domestic politicians that I could be made in trouble if I ever made such statements. Let me just be clear with that. But point being is, I guess just from a human interest level, it's sucks that a guy just got shot in the middle of the street, but I mean, ultimately, for his legacy as a politician and prime minister, it's not really much to speak of, in my opinion. Now,
Yeah, for us, I mean, I suppose I think he'll be well regarded there, um, based on what I saw. Like I agree with you. For me, he's unobjectionable. He's not remarkable either. I don't know what to say. I mean, it could be much worse. It could be far worse. I'll say that.
yeah, I know that.
And who knows? As things escalate, who knows what kind of leader Japan will get.
Yeah, and that's a real question. I think the most thing you could probably praise him for, depending on your point of view, is that he was critical of some of the Article 9 stipulations in the Japanese Constitution that barred
Hmm.
the size and scope of its military. In which
Yeah.
case, I can imagine an American empire that would want a more militaristic Japan just to take burden off of America insofar as East Asia is concerned. But I mean, beyond that, there were some good memes with him and Trump. I guess that's kind of like I'm sure you all remember how much of a deal the media made out of the feeding of the koi fish. But yeah, I saw a pretty funny video reel of just him and Trump, and I'll say like when it comes to Trump's more memeable side, they meshed well together. But as a politician, as a leader, and somebody in charge of a country and policy, it may disappoint some of you, but I really don't have much to say about the guy.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have nothing really negative to say about him. It was shocking. I mean, I will say that. According to Biden, it's the first time that an Asian politician or a Japanese politician has been killed with a gun. Is he doing trivia? I don't know.
I I I guess, but I know. I think
Biden is hilarious.
um well, I know like just from an objective standpoint, he was the first former prime minister to be assassinated since some of the power plays in the 1930s, right before the outbreak of
Right,
war with China. So,
right. Good point.
if you want to read too much into that, I don't know, but I mean that's really all I had for that. I mean, we could get into like some of the Biden gaffes, but I don't really think those are enough to warrant another segment of the show. Biden just misread. He read repeat the line on the teleprompter instead of actually repeating the
Yeah.
line. So, um, the West has never been stronger, as your friend has let us
Yeah.
know. But that's all I had for today.
Yeah. I just thought of two more stories that are kind of in the news. One of them more serious than the other, and that is um, the, the dispute between Russia and Lithuania. So Lithuania apparently has caved. They've negotiated with Germany to allow passage of Russian goods, though they will be limited uh, to a certain degree, but not as limited as what they've currently been doing. Russia has expressed that they want a resolution very quickly if Lithuania does not want a retaliation. Scholz is really actually is the one who put pressure on Lithuania here to act because I think Germany's suffering the most. And whatever anyone thinks about Germany in the EU, and a lot of countries feel like they suffered because of them, and some of them rightly so. The truth is if Germany gets economically weaker, the rest of the EU is going to feel it, and that is what is happening now. The other story, though less serious, is Svalbard, which is this archipelago of Arctic islands uh, north of Russia and Norway. They belong to Norway. There have been Russian miners and settlers there for a long time, about 3,000. Norway blocked any passage. So, I mean, this was like threatening to starve them out. Russia met with Norway, and basically they're going to use Norwegian ships to deliver the goods there instead of Russian ships. So that's been resolved. But that's all I have.
Once again, it looks like the West is very unified in this front against the Russian menace. But I suppose we'll see you all next time. I hope you enjoyed this little bit longer edition of the War Report, and we will see you then, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.